Welcome to the Life Expansion After 50 podcast. This is the third part of our series on the unseen power of words. In our first session, we explored how words influence our world. In our second, we focused on beliefs and the silent drivers behind the words that we choose, and how those beliefs set the stage for our actions. Today, we're moving further into the pre-stimulus stage of the stimulus response cycle, exploring priming. The words that prime us, and the words we use that prime others, for both positive and negative outcomes. Specifically, the topic is transformational vocabulary. If you've heard of this before, stay tuned. I'm taking it to another level. As business owners and leaders, we may think of transformational vocabulary as simple shifts like changing from problem to challenge. Now, while useful, that barely scratches the surface. Words are powerful enough to cause conflicts, dissolve partnerships, spark collaborations, drive breakthroughs. They're the tools that coaches use to teach, inspire, and motivate performance. And while many have heard the statistic that words are only 7% of communication, with 38% being nonverbals and 55% physiology, we know there are times when words carry far more weight than 7%. In project updates, for example, in scope discussions, or sales meetings, we listen intently because words reveal models of thought, perceived gaps, and deeper truths. The subconscious often speaks through words, filling in gaps left by the conscious mind. Something investigators rely on when interviewing suspects to uncover underlying stories. Priming connects to this idea. Unchecked, it predisposes us to react a certain way to an upcoming event or cue. But with intention, we can use priming to prepare ourselves before external stimuli reach us. Given that around 95% of our lives are guided by habit, breaking automatic patterns is essential for pursuing self-actualization and expanding our potential. While we cannot prevent external factors from affecting us or reaching us, we can control our response by priming ourselves in advance, turning potential triggers into mere data points instead of all-consuming influences. The concept aligns with life expansion after 50, where breaking habitual patterns leads to growth. Later in this series, I'll discuss how to recover when, despite all your efforts, you're still hijacked and respond in a way that's inconsistent with your intentions. In personal leadership, priming with intention is a must. As leaders, we need to be aware of how we're priming our teams. As business owners, how we're priming our customers. Today, we're considering how the words that you choose to set the stage for your own behavior and influence those around you directly and indirectly. Paying attention to how we prime ourselves is where our agency lies, and through that agency, we can reach our untapped potential. Words are anchors, and they connect us to thoughts, emotions, responses. Priming is a powerful form of anchoring, shaping how we interpret information, make decisions, and act. Think of the times you've walked into a meeting prepared by your internal dialogue, whether that priming was positive or negative. The words we use don't just affect our mindset momentarily, they light up parts of our brains, activating neurons, which are connected to other neurons, and that change can affect how we feel and how we perform. The good news is all this can be modulated, not just by words, but words are a big part of it. There are other parts of the stimulus response cycle that I'll cover in upcoming meetings to complete the process of regaining agency. Meanwhile, understanding this means taking responsibility for the language we use with ourselves and others. Priming isn't limited to the immediate moment. It can occur hours or even days in advance. In business, our self-talk can become our consistent companion and coach, or it can be our self-induced resistance factor. Leaders who recognize this can guide themselves back to a growth mindset, even when stress or setbacks trigger old patterns. Now, when I talk about returning to a growth mindset, I'm talking about doing so literally in seconds. This is possible, and by the end of this series, you'll know the steps. Doing them consistently, that's up to you, but you'll know the steps. Priming also works externally. The words you choose when speaking to your team, partners, or clients can prime them for collaboration. resilience, or growth. Or it could paint a picture of red flags. In every role we play, being mindful of how we prime ourselves and others is worth the effort, because it's not only our life that's run 95% by habits, the lives of the people we interact with are also running 95% by habit. The priming that is in play at any given moment can change the outcome of how we think or what happens in our stimulus response cycle. As mentioned, I'm taking that two-step process that occurs in less than a second and breaking it into 8 steps. Priming is the third of those steps. While words are not the only tool we have for priming, it is one of the areas that's most accessible, probably provides the best return on effort, because it's the words we use are so often overlooked in terms of managing our own behavior. We think that they don't matter. We've heard 7%, but I'm telling you, they matter. And you can run experiments with yourself to show that. Before jumping into today's focus on transformational vocabulary, I want to give you 2 examples of priming that caused me to take a second look at this area. And I thought I understood it. I thought I understood priming fairly well. And then I read John Barger's book, Before You Know It. And he provides some examples in that book. And some of these examples are also in Robert Cialdini's book, Persuasion. Robert Cialdini, he wrote the book Influence sometime in the late 80s. And that was the first introduction I had to the cognitive biases and how priming is such a powerful tool, and also the words we use. The simple word, I talked about it last week or the week before, the simple word of adding because into a sentence can actually change the compliance regardless of what follows behind it. So the 2 priming examples, most of us have heard about the experiment where they told teachers that the blue-eyed kids were smarter than the brown-eyed kids, and they've done other ones. They've done the kids in this row or in these rows are smarter than the kids in those rows. They've run the experiment different ways to try to take out bias. A couple of researchers took it even to another level. They said this is all very interesting, and by the way, it went on to show that if a person is taking an exam and you prime them with their ethnicity, that they perform better or worse depending on the narrative of that ethnicity and exams, in this case, math. But also, if they use gender as you filling out the form, depending on the narrative around gender and math, it changed the people's performance, good or bad. So the researchers became curious, and they said, well, what happens if we use Asian American girls, and these were high school students, Asian American girls, because in America, it's thought that women are less proficient at math than men, but at the same time, Asians are perceived to be better at math than other ethnicities. So they said, what happens if we put those 2 together? Interesting. If they asked for gender, obviously they did worse, based on what I've already said. And if they primed with ethnicity, they did better. But then they started combining it. And if they did ethnicity first, they did better than if they did gender first. Very fascinating that it went to that level. And that got me thinking that, okay, maybe I need to take another look at this priming, because one of the things I was running into with life expansion after 50, especially after people are in their 60s, very, very difficult for them to make shifts and step into this idea of life expansion. I mentioned self-actualization or going after purpose, and their eyes gloss over. Now, at first I thought it was because they were connecting it too much to work. So I started changing my language around that. And priming is a part of it. The condition is a part of it. I talked about that last week with belief and how the belief can change the condition, and then our condition impacts our state. And then that is a big part of the pre-stimulus. So I actually have to go way back to the belief section and start working there to get people to see that there's something possible. That's why a lot of the content I do is about rising above the line. I talk about what it's like to cross that river. Now, everybody's not going to want to cross that river or cross that barrier, but at least they understand what's at play, and they have some labels so that when those things like cognitive dissonance shows up, they know what to expect. Same thing with emotional modulation, giving them the belief and I'm not saying this is a belief I'm handing, this is them internalizing the belief that they have agency and then they can reset their positive mindset even when chaos shows up. So that's one thing that came out of this priming example. The other example he shared, and this is, by the way, peer-reviewed research. So John Barge is a neuroscientist, been studying the subconscious for decades, and his audience are neuroscientists, doctors, healthcare professionals, etc., the medical community. This one threw me, but now it makes perfect sense once I worked through it. They had three, and you understand double-blind studies, etc. They had three examples. In one, the person did not have anything in their hand at all. In another one, they had a cup of warm liquid, coffee, for example, tea, it didn't matter. And in another one, they had a cup or glass of cold liquid. What was in the liquid didn't matter. It was the temperature. And then they measured, using control groups, etc., the level of compassion in a response to a particular cue or situation. And they got the baseline. When the person was holding warm liquid, they responded more compassionately. That was like, whew. When the person was holding cold liquid, they responded less compassionately compared to the control group. So we had a swing in compassion based on what was in the person's hands. Now, at first glance, that's like, how could that be? But when you remember that the subconscious is really a network of neurons, it's not the mind, it's a network of neurons, and neurons is all physiological, right? I talk about that. When a person dies, their nervous system is still on the ground. This is body. The subconscious is actually part of the body. It's not part of the mind. The mind is the mind. The subconscious is the brain. It's the 100 billion neurons, 86 billion in the brain, 14 billion throughout the body. And those neurons are where the associations are. The neurons are what get wrapped with myelin when you use deep practice. That's where habits are formed. That's where you get muscle memory. That's why athletes can go from a quarter of a second reaction time down to about 150 milliseconds, because they're wrapped with myelin, and it creates a faster, more accurate, quicker response or reaction through those neural pathways. Makes it harder for habits to break, but the good news is that you can still change habits by laying another one over, because it's the neurotransmitter that moves. The neuron stays wrapped with myelin, but the neurotransmitter moves from the neural pathways that are not being used to the ones that are being used. So to change a habit, you focus on the new habit and you allow the other one to basically self-eliminate on the neurotransmitter. So those two examples showed me that why the deck felt stacked against me. It's also why I moved from 60 focusing on 65 and over down to 50. Because at 50, people are still engaged, they're in the workplace, they're surrounded by people, and they have more opportunities to use some of these tools and apply them. And basically, I don't want to sit and teach about stimulus response like I'm doing here in a vacuum. The way to teach it and train it is to actually use real world things because I've got to get them triggered in order to, not that this like, I'm not cruel, no. You have to know where their limitations are, because the limitations, that's where the survival reactions come from. I don't care how capable a person is. When they hit that threshold and it turns into a survival response, they close in. It goes back to the neural pathways. It's what worked in the past, and that's what comes out. When you look at these movies that are showing, like Navy SEALs and Rangers, it's because, and they seem calm no matter what, it's because they've been there, they've done it, they've trained for that, so they stay out. They keep the vision out. It's very hard to get a survival reaction from somebody that you've basically broken the survival reaction mechanism. See, for most of us, if we haven't had that training, and I remember going through it, how you didn't know it was happening at the time, but looking back, see, we walk through life. Every threat to the subconscious is a tiger. Once that's broken, and there's different ways of breaking it. You don't have to go through SEAL training or Army Ranger training to break that connection that every threat is a Serengeti tiger. And that's why I'm doing this 8-part series on stimulus response, because stimulus response is not just 2 steps. It's 8 steps, at least, that I talk about, that once you get a handle on each of these, the thing that happens at the end is that you have context for agency. Why? Because you know that no matter what comes your way, you're prepared to handle it. And even for those few things, because we're above the line, we're working in infinite possibilities, and infinite possibilities can go both ways, right? You can be surprised by something. Even when something gets through all of that and still sends you into survival reaction, we have a mechanism to get you back on track within 2 minutes. What that does for a business owner, it allows you to take a little bit more risk. Now, I always say manage the risk, because now we're above the line and infinite possibilities. There's more VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It may not be more, but there's more that we're exposed to, because now we're above the line. We're out of our comfort zone. We're going to be potentially triggered more often, and we don't really know where that next potential trigger is coming from, or stressor, I'll call it. So what we have to do is be prepared. And I don't do this with belief. I do it with skill. We do it with skills, because belief, eventually what will happen is, if you only do it with belief, and most people have experienced this, if you only do it with belief, eventually what happens is that a stressor is so great that the trigger kicks in an old belief that they hadn't worked on, and now they're back into spiraling. So we have to have a way that works despite the potential for belief being triggered. And that's what we do. That's down the road, but that's in step 8. And it is the last step, because the first 7 will solve 80 to 90% of the stuff you encounter. But that one thing that comes across that's perceived as existential, that will take you over the top, and that's where we use that last one. But we'll get there. 8 weeks, and we got 5 more to go. So those are the 2 things. Now, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the transformational vocabulary. I said some of you may have heard about this before. I've used the example, instead of saying problem, say opportunity. Way back in sales, when I was first learning sales in late 70s, early 80s, they taught us to say investment, not spend or not buy. You don't buy something, you invest in it. And that's old school, but it still works. Now remember, words are anchors. If you've done any kind of motivational type or self-development type work, I'm sure have come across anchors and how we can anchor ourselves. I use an anchor, especially when I was going on stage speaking. I would get myself up to a heightened state. Some may know the wool clap, but I would get myself to a heightened state. And you don't have to get yourself into a heightened state. You can wait until you're in a heightened state. For example, you're doing something that's really exhilarating. You just skied a mogul run, or maybe you nailed a trick and you're excited. Kick that anchor in. Yes, kick in the anchor. Reinforce it. Kick in the anchor, and get in the habit of doing that every time you get into that heightened state. Alternatively, you can get yourself into a heightened state and then kick in the anchor. Mine is yes. And that one little word, because I've used it so many times in a heightened state, I can get into state right before going on stage, and it's reliable. I don't have to worry about it. And I've used it so long, I basically applied deep practice, which means I've got that neural pathway wrapped with myelin. And you can do the same thing. But anchors work the other way too. Anchors can trigger emotions. They can trigger memories. And if you've harbored a lot of negative emotions, which most of us have learned to do because you suppress it, when you suppress it, the emotion gets into your neurons, and then it becomes a biochemical event, and that can be brought up. When you let the emotions pass through, we'll cover this later on in future episodes, but when you let the emotions pass through, which is what we're supposed to, 90 seconds, you surf the emotion, you let it pass through. They were never meant to be dwelled upon and turned into a feeling. Then it's not there in your neurons. It's emotion, and then it's energy and motion. Emotion, right? Energy and motion. It passes through, and you're able to get back on track. This is why we're able to get back to a growth mindset in seconds. Once that feeling kicks in, and you got the cortisol running through your body and all this other stuff, it makes it a little bit harder. And it takes time, because now it's a chemical event happening. It's not just the mind, and you've got to let that chemical event subside. Not only that, I have this vision that the neurons it's like a mob, right? There's 100 billion of them. Think about it, 100 billion neurons. So these neurons are connected to those. And each neuron, by the way, is connected with anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 or more other neurons. So as these neurons fire, they're firing and connecting others. And the longer you stay in that state, The longer you stay in that feeling, the more and more and more neurons get connected. So you're seeing how I'm connecting this with the words. And so we can use words and trigger that set of emotions. We know that words light up different parts of the brain. As those different parts of the brain light up, what that's telling you is neurons are being activated. If neurons are being activated, you can bet they're pulling in other neurons. So prevention is always, not always, but in my view, when we're talking about business, leadership, and selling, prevention is always preferable to correction. In sales, I teach people that these things are going to come, so pre-frame them. Don't wait for the objection to come. Prime the person with how to think about that particular thing so they don't see it as an objection, they see it as an advantage. You do that in advance. You don't wait until they're already triggered, because once they say no, now that no's lit up some neurons, and those neurons are firing. What you want is those yeses, right? That's why they say if you get a person saying yes enough times, you can predict when the close is going to be successful, because they've said yes. They've got enough yes neurons firing. That's why the yes questions exist in sales presentations. So words, I mentioned, they activate different parts of the brain. They can change your states. Now, there's a lot of talk about affirmations, and I know anybody who's into self-development, they've used affirmations. They've seen success, and they've seen where they didn't work. I would say in my own life, affirmations probably were reliable 20% of the time. But if you think about placebos are good maybe 30% of the time, and some placebos are used in addition to or in place of prescription medication. So a prescription drug can be successful 30% of the time and people are still okay with it. So I wouldn't throw affirmations out, but I think you can refine them, and that gets back to the words. So if we're walking around saying, I hate this job, I hate what I'm doing, I don't like what I'm doing, I'm tired of this makes me sick. We spend all day saying that, and then we say some affirmations. I'm good at my job, I'm good at sales, I'm a dynamic salesperson, but yet we're saying, I hate my job, I hate my job. We're doing that. We got 65,000 waking seconds in a day. How many seconds were spent on those thoughts versus the affirmations? So that's step one. I'm not going to say that's the end all be all, but you're going to make progress just by eliminating some of the words that you're habitually saying. Identifying them first, obviously, and then eliminating them. When we talk about affirmations, we know that they should be present tense, and it's not I will do this or I'm going to do that. It's I am this. But here's one of the challenges, and this gets into my transformational vocabulary. Sometimes the person is not ready for the I am this. And so you can use an on-ramp. You can use affirmations as on-ramps. I'm going to. And this gets back to things like a growth mindset. The simple word adding yet. I don't know how to do it yet. That's a form of an affirmation if you think about it. But they've shown that if a person just says yet at the end of the statement, it moves them into a growth mindset. When I talk about moving back to a growth mindset after you've been triggered, it's going to take a lot more than just yet, but we'll cover that. But in terms of maintaining a growth mindset or early catching that path where you start going fixed, you can use the word yet. I don't know how to do it yet. And I would say that yes, you do want to get to the point where your affirmations are present tense, positive, and I am type statements, but sometimes you may need a little bit of an on-ramp to get your belief system going. So last week I talked about belief. Imagine if you're in the dumps and you're thinking the world is ending for you and you just can't get it. Affirmations are probably not going to pull you out of that because there's too many other neurons and you're using too much other language. They're competing. Those affirmations are competing with other words that you've said. So one of the things that we have to do with our vocabulary is learn to identify those detractor words that we're using. Those detractor words that we're using actually hurt every other principle that we talk about. And because the subconscious is biased towards the negative, it makes it even worse, right? Because it's already biased towards looking for threats. And now you're throwing these words out there. I hate my job, or I don't like this, or I'm tired of this. This makes me sick. Yeah, I'm tired. This is getting old, whatever. Those are priming the subconscious, and it's just going to reinforce and give you more of that. It's all logical once you look at the subconscious as a network of neurons. It's all logical because you feed fuel to a mob. Depending on what you feed them, they're going to either get more agitated or they're going to calm down. The neurons, I look at it as the same way. It's very, very fractal in our world, and you can learn a lot of things about what's going on inside by looking outside once you see them as neurons. Doesn't make sense if you look at the subconscious as a mind. And I don't want to belabor the point here because I cover it in probably just about every session. But if you look at a list of what the subconscious does, and then you look at a list of what the network of neurons do, you'll see that it's the same thing. So why would we have a subconscious mind and a network of neurons that does the same thing as the subconscious mind? You notice I don't call it a mind. Once you see it as the same thing, then you can start managing it, because now we're doing things that make sense, that are applied to a more physiological phenomena rather than something that is something you can't see. So the structure of words, how you use them, matter. One of the things that I did, and I built multiple high-performing, 7 or 8 high-performing teams, because I was the guy who was brought in to turn major projects around. We were serving 40,000 producers nationally, and these big projects would go out to like change. You're constantly doing big projects. We were working with McKinsey, Deloitte & Touche, Accenture, Capgemini, etc. Right, and so they would come in, and I would be working side by side with them. And I was the one who was brought in to turn the projects around because they were failing. Should have been out a long time ago. Because I was trained in neurolinguistic programming and I understood some of this stuff that I'm talking about now, and I was able to apply it. I applied it on myself. I also applied it with the people. It's not something you do to somebody, but it's understanding what's going on internally. And one of the things that showed up a lot is this word try. What I noticed as I walked into these situations and I was having people give me updates in the lay of the land, they would often use the word try. What we're trying to do, they're going to try and try. And at first glance, you think, well, that's not a very positive. It's kind of like say yet, right? To get to a growth mindset. That's not a very positive way of saying it. But what I uncovered as I worked through it and experimented with different approaches is, like many things, it goes both ways. What I did was go way upstream to why they were saying try in the first place. The logic is this. If you leave the office today, you don't say, I'm going to go to the parking lot and try to start my car. You don't say, I'm going to try to go to the parking lot. You don't say, I'm going to try to drive home. You say, yeah, I'm going home. There's no try in there. And what I noticed was, if I did nothing else, and I wouldn't do this in a meeting. I do this by calling people to the side because I don't want to get them triggered. They're already stressed out, right? Because the project is way behind. They think they're all going to be let go, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out the people were fine. It's that the short version is that because these projects were above the line into the new, and the unfamiliar is seen as a threat, people are running into these threats, and so it's harder. But also, if you're a project leader, if you're a leader in an organization, you have responsibility for project, understand that you want to identify the new part of the project, the part that's never been done before, and that 20% is going to take 80% of the time. That's it. That right there, if you do nothing else but that, and what you do then is you put the 20% off into a phase 2. You declare a phase 2. Project managers sometimes will push back, but you're the leader. So you put the 20% into phase 2, and you start figuring out some of that 20% while you're doing the 80%. If you don't do that, human nature has us doing the project 50% through. We should be at 50% time. We should be 50% through the project. You're cooked, because the 20% that's new and above the line in the possibility realm, if you've never done it before, you're going to run into all kinds of challenges and problems. Because people are running associations and habits from the past, and it just causes more and more and more problems. Then they have short-term fixes. So you need to be into that 20% when you are 20% into the timeline. That's just not realistic. People can't think that way. So that's why I just put it into a phase 2. Just do that one little thing. You'll notice that your big gnarly projects get easier. So anyway, this word try, I found out that when I pulled people aside and say, so what's going on? I noticed you were saying that, I noticed you were not real comfortable. I sometimes I wouldn't even mention the word try because I didn't want them to think I was talking about positive mental attitude. I would ask them, so what's going on that makes this so difficult? And they would start telling me. It's like a list of things, and they pull some code off the shelf that they thought would work, but that had some security issues, and that led to some other things. And it's if you just listen for the word try as a leader, and then go have a conversation about that thing that they were talking about, but don't introduce that you heard them say try, because that could put them on the defensive. And just listen to what they're saying. Don't judge. Certainly don't answer, because what you want them to do is get through that first level of thinking, right? That public persona. You want to get into that private persona. You want to get into that, vulnerable space where they're telling you things that they only tell their best friends, and that's when you're going to find out why the project is failing. So that little simple thing right there will turn some of these gnarly projects around for you. Better yet, use it as prevention. So that word try, I would definitely listen for it. But it goes the other way too. If I say try, just like if I say pick up that pen that's on your desk, try to pick it up. No, and you pick it up. I say no, try to pick it up. Trying is standing still. Trying is stationary. You have to get that word try out. So I would say that 80% of what I did with respect to high performing teams was on the other end of try, using try to find out where people were uncomfortable and then resolving that for them. Only about 20% actually applied to try in the context of positive mental attitude. So that's just something to think about as we're talking about transformational vocabulary. So I mentioned, we went from problem to challenge. Some other word pairs you could think about: angry to annoyed, or maybe, when I first learned this 30 years ago, I went from embarrassed to amused. That didn't maybe make sense, but it did for me, because I never wanted to feel embarrassed. If you think about it, most of the reason we don't do things is because we don't want to be embarrassed. Well, if you could take the power out of that word, then that word doesn't have the power to stop you. It's no longer a threat. The subconscious doesn't see it as a Serengeti tiger. Instead of saying hard, you can say challenging, or you can say it's testing me, or building new skills. You could talk about it's unfamiliar, and these are more empowering. You could talk about overwhelmed. I changed overwhelmed to it's time to chunk. This is in the context of the mind can only hold 7 to 9 chunks of information at a time. So if I'm feeling overwhelmed, I said, well, if I'm overwhelmed, that means I need to chunk up. Because if I take the 9 chunks and put them back into 6 or 7, I'm back on track. So I would say, instead of overwhelmed, I would say it's time to up chunk. Now, and I would literally use those words. I used in sales, I used rejection, because call reluctance was a thing. And instead of seeing when someone says no, because you're doing, you're dialing for 2 hours and maybe getting, 1 good solid lead or 2 good solid leads out of that, it's like you got to be able to stay up, right? So what I would do is, instead of looking at it as rejected, I would say it's unappreciated. I used to sell life insurance, and so you have basically 30% closing ratio, but still that means 7 times out of 10 you're not getting it. Instead of rejected, I just saw it as unappreciated. And literally, I would call it, it's just they didn't appreciate what I had to offer. No worries, because then it's like, so what? Who's next? Someone's waiting. You don't worry about it. You're looking for the people who do appreciate it and spending your time with them. Now, the way I'm talking about this is much bigger than just problem and challenge, and it's getting to why I was talking about try. The word rejection has power, because when I asked you to come up with some words as we're talking about this, I mentioned that last week, to come up with some words, some emotions, identify some emotions that you regularly feel, and what words you put with it. So if we have emotions that have been pretty intense, so think about a salesperson, and they've had a string of no's, right? And they're kind of down. You can see this picture. If you're a sales manager, you know this. You got to get them pumped back up, right? That gets intense. That feeling is associated with the word rejection. In my case, it was associated with the word rejection. So the simple thought of rejection, guess what? It's firing neurons. And as those neurons fire, they bring in other negative things. If I got other stuff going on in my life, those neurons are already primed to, jump on the negative bandwagon. Next thing you know, I'm feeling down and low, and, the house is on fire, right? The other thing, though, because the subconscious doesn't like a vacuum, part 2 of this, and they don't talk about this often with transformational vocabulary, you have to put in a new word. And that's why I talk about rejection and unappreciated, but you've got to put in a new word for that thing. Because if you don't put in a new word for that thing that used to be called rejection, there's enough neurons that connected to rejection, it'll just come back. That's why a lot of times people will make a change and it doesn't stick. It's because there's so many neurons associated with it that with the vacuum, it just fills back in. This is why I talked about the neural pathways getting wrapped with myelin, etc. What you want to do is layer new neural pathways on top of that. And it's like taking your attention and putting it into a specific place. Take your attention and move it to a specific place, because if you don't do that, the other neural pathways will keep firing, and if they keep firing, the neurotransmitter doesn't self-eliminate, and then you've got that challenge. I came up with a new definition for rejection. I was wanting to take the skills I learned from Ranger School and apply them into the business world. And it wasn't a natural fit, because on the one hand, you're running towards gunfire, and on the other hand, you're dealing with these problems that pop up. And that was probably the genesis for a lot of this work. But anyway, what I came up with was, if I don't go after my goals because of fear, then I'm feeling massive rejection. So I gave rejection, because rejection had so much power over me. I wanted to avoid that word rejection, that state of rejection. So I said, if I'm not going after my goals, and the reason is because of fear, then that's rejection for me. I did the same thing with embarrassment, because I had told you I didn't want to be embarrassed, so I used the word amused. It made it funny, right? And that worked. But I also said, well, you know what? I don't like being embarrassed, so why don't I change give a new word for that state? And so in the beginning I said, I did the same thing. I was kind of lazy with it. I said, yeah, if I'm not going after my goals and I'm not doing action, then that's embarrassing to me. But later I updated it to be, if I'm shirking my responsibilities, if I'm not doing what I said I was going to do, then I'm embarrassed. So that's on me, right? That's my personal leadership. I don't have to tell you. I say I'm going to do this, and if I don't do it, then I'm feeling embarrassed. And because I avoid the feeling of embarrassed already, this is like what James Clear talks about in Atomic Habits. The neural pathways are already there, connected to embarrassed. I just changed the meaning, so now I use the leverage that embarrassed already had over me to apply it to something more positive that I was going after. Another one would be obligation. You may be obligated to do something. I hear somebody say obligated. The work I'm doing is above the line. This is all about infinite possibilities. If you're using the word you're obligated to do something, we got to change that. We got to figure out, well, wait a minute, where's the purpose come in? Where's the self-actualization come in? To find out what's going on and get them out of this obligated state. Instead of I'm obligated to do it, as I get to do it. But you can't just do it with changing the words. You have to go back and, like I said, you first change the thing on obligated to I get to, and then you find out what was causing them to say obligated, what was it about that, and then give that a new label of opportunity. So it's not about obligated, it's about I have the opportunity. So it's just changing the word that you're using over here, but then also coming up with another word to replace how you used to use that word in the past. And any coach will tell you that they're constantly listening for these words. The words give so many clues, and that's what we go on. I mean, because the words are telling you what's going on. This is why I say words are not 7%. They might be in depending on where you're sitting, but if I'm the listener, if I'm the one asking questions, if I'm asking questions and I'm in fact finding, I'm 100% on those words. Those words are telling me the story I need to hear, and I'm listening for. It's not already listening. You can't be already listening because you don't know their model of the world. I'm literally mapping their model of the world as I listen to them. We all have 100 billion neurons, but all those neurons are not firing in the same places. Some people feel emotion here, some people feel emotion here, some people feel emotion here. For some people, the past is over here. For some people, the past is over here. Some people, the past is behind them. You got to figure out what's that model of the world, and you can do that by listening to the words. And I didn't talk about this last week when I was talking about condition and how we talked about the belief and that we're in a particular condition. I didn't talk about state because state is a part of it, but what happens is condition can overpower state. If you don't already have the conditioning in place, then you're not going to be able to maintain the state. You've got to be able to condition that back to a growth mindset, or that negative fixed mindset will overpower your efforts into getting into a more positive state. So this is what we covered last week. I had the beliefs in the condition. That was what we were just saying. And that created this condition. Then I talked about how, if you take beliefs and then it goes into your condition and you get results, it reinforces the belief. What we have to do is take action. And by taking action, now you get a different result. That reinforces the belief. And then I pushed it even further. And I said, well, what we really want to do is you have a belief, and then we're going to have, you believe that you have more potential. You start exercising, you step into using more potential. That potential gives you a different action, and that different action gives you a different result. And then that reinforces. So by doing that, we move this precondition that we were in before starting to do this work, and it's a new condition over here. This condition, you could think of it as, and this is not an absolute statement, right? It's not, the condition in and of itself is not necessarily a resistance factor. It's in the context of your life design. It's in the context of your pursuit of purpose. It's in the context of you rising above the line, around crossing that barrier. If this condition is not helping you, it's probably a resistance factor. And so what we want to do is reset that by this belief, stepping into more potential, taking bigger, more aligned action, getting a better, more aligned result, and letting that reinforce my belief. This is one way of changing the beliefs. There's other things we've got to talk about too. And I did an exercise. In fact, if you go to the episode 64, it's worthwhile to do that episode, listen to that episode and do the exercise, because without that exercise, you could be chasing belief change for all your life. Many people have been trying to change beliefs for 20 years, and this one exercise, you can change it in literally less than an hour if you choose to. And this is not, none of this is mental health. So you gotta, you have to make the choice. And the context is your purpose or your self-actualization or your vision or whatever it is that you're wanting to accomplish. If we don't have that bigger thing, we're not ready to work, right? So I need to have that bigger thing, and then we can go on to the next level. So then anyway, the condition goes over here. That leaves us with priming. So we spent time on belief. Then we're going to go to priming. When we hit condition the next time, then we'll be focusing on some of the words that we're talking about today. And then this one here is beliefs and stories. So we had stories over here, which led to our belief. But now what we're going to do is change our stories. And you may not be able to, you don't necessarily have to change your story that you had from the past, but it's which stories you tell yourself. It's which parts of the stories do you hold up. There's no benefit, generally speaking, in pursuing the life that you're designing and a life that you'll love living in arguing for the opposition. Now, there's a corollary of mental contrasting where you don't want to underestimate the opposition. You have to acknowledge, just like the Stockdale paradox, acknowledging that what we're doing is hard, but also at the same time acknowledging that we're going to prevail. So that's different than just arguing for the opposition or arguing for your weaknesses. Yes, it's hard, and yes, we will prevail. It's having those two things existing at the same time that happens over here. So anyway, we're talking about priming now, and what I want to do is talk about a different way of using these words. So I already used rejected. That became unappreciated. But let's say we go in between and we say overlooked. And maybe we go from overlooked to misunderstood. And from misunderstood, maybe we go to unappreciated. So what I've done here is given you an on-ramp to get to that word unappreciated. You may not be able to go from rejected to unappreciated, but if you can go through overlooked or misunderstood. So this is why I said I'm taking transformational vocabulary to another level. It's not just going from disappointed to curious. It's going from disappointed to surprised, maybe. Let's call it surprised. And then from surprised, we can go to unexpected. And from unexpected, we can go to curious. Think about emotions, some emotions that occur for you on a regular basis that may even get in the way. And for these emotions, I want you to come up with the word that you most often use. And to help you out, because I'll talk about these 8 emotions in the future as well when we get into emotional modulation. So while these may not be the ones you're feeling, it's a good start because, and if you use these, use your own if you have one, but if you don't have one, I'll give you some. So we've got anger. We already did disappointed, so that's 2. Embarrassed, that would be 3. Helpless is 4. Sadness is 5. Shame or ashamed is 6. Vulnerability, and then frustrated would be 8. So you can use those words, or you can use one that you have yourself. And I want you to think about the emotion that you're feeling. Literally try to go back into the state where you are feeling that. Just go back into that state, and you're thinking about this word. Now, let's say the word is rejected. And I'm going to say, is it totally rejected? Or can we maybe call it unappreciated? Or can we maybe call it misunderstood? And if you don't do this right and you're leading with emotion, the emotion will get you to say, no, it's rejected. It's like, are you really angry? Or could we call this maybe like you're annoyed? If you don't do that right as you ask yourself, no, I'm angry. What you're doing is you're not tapping into the side that wants to argue for your weaknesses. You want to tap into the side that's looking for the life that you want to design. And then look at it on a spectrum. Take the thing that made you the most angry in your entire life, and let's call that angry. That's angry. And then where does this fit on that spectrum? Is this like in the middle, or is it way over here to this thing that's I'm just slightly annoyed, or slightly off-putted, it's kind of off-putting. That's way over here. So everything can't be slammed up against this side of angry. So this is how you start to get there. And see if you can come up with 4 or 3 additional words. So another one we might take is, I'll use angry, and that could go to frustrated, which is another one of the 8 emotions, by the way. And that could go to annoyed. This is the one I use a lot on myself, annoyed. And then that one can go to concerned. And then we can do another one. We could do sad. And I want you to, as you do this with yourself, I want you to notice, and you can kind of lead with this. Lead with it. Notice how it's like a weight being lifted off your shoulders. Is it really sad, or can we say it's just a little bit down? Use your own words if you can, but if not, do it with this. And then, is it really down, or maybe you're disappointed in the outcome? What we want to do is keep things from being slammed up against the worst case scenario, because the subconscious is already looking at everything as a Serengeti tiger. So we've got to get it off that track and off that path. And then from there, we may have, that might be a stretch. But you can see when we are sad, we tend to ponder, and you can see that ponder is like being thoughtful. And you can even add ponder as one of the words here. This is transformational vocabulary, doing it the right way. Then I want you to take that feeling that you had, that emotion, and look at what caused it. What caused that emotion? Let's say if somebody, they didn't call you or whatever it was, and that's what caused the sadness or being angry. And now we want to turn it around and make it a behavior that you want to change. So for example, let's say you turn down a speaking opportunity. Someone asks you, hey, you want to come online? You want to speak and do this joint effort, do some collaboration online in a live event? And you want to do it, but you say no because you're not comfortable with how you look on camera. That could be disappointed. You could say, I'm disappointed in myself. So you're taking the power of the disappointment. If you say you're going to do 2 hours of calls on Tuesday and you don't do the calls, you could say that makes me angry. It makes me angry at myself when I don't do what I'm supposed to do. So you're taking the word that used to make you feel like that because you want to avoid that. So the other thing that's happening with this backdrop is that we're putting things in our control. You see, you can't have agency as long as control over your emotions and your state and your energy is out there. In order to have agency, you have to control it here. And that's where we talk about the 7 fitness areas, the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. And I talk about doing laps because as you step into higher ground, as you step into bigger challenges, you have to bring another level with you. You can think of about it like character But the point is you have to have a new set of responses for the stuff that's going to come your way. And the only way you're going to do that is by stepping through those doors. You got to step through the doors. And so what we want to do is use this transformational vocabulary to get us to step through more of the doors. So we're going from shifting from having the words be a resistance factor or leading to a resistance factor and turning them into an empowerment catalyst. And next week, same time, we're going to pick up in this and we'll spend time on the beliefs and the stories, a little bit of revisit in this condition. I'll wrap those up in the two because we've already kind of talked about them, but this is on the positive side. You could almost think about it like over here we were talking about it on the fixed mindset side, and when we get over here we'll be talking about it on the growth mindset side, because that's what happens from here to here is we move into having a growth mindset. And I talk about a growth mindset is not I have a growth mindset. It's you can have a growth mindset on parts of a certain thing, call it, your job. You can have a growth mindset around parts of your job and a fixed mindset around others. You can have a growth mindset around some of your skills and a fixed mindset around some others. You want to be able to identify, using your growth mindset, where you still have a fixed mindset. That's what we talk about in here, is because we want to go into our stimulus response with the deck stacked in our favor. And remember, when you're above the line, we're working into infinite possibilities. We don't know where that next cue is going to come from. We don't know where that next stressor is going to come from. We have to be ready for everything. So the work doesn't stop here with the growth mindset. All this does is allows you to step into the situation from the right frame. If you step into this situation with a fixed mindset, you're cooked before you start. And then once we're in here, we'll blow this up, and that's going to start giving the tools of what you do in the during. So this is pre-stimulus, during stimulus response, and then post-stimulus response. And we use that when you get hijacked, when something got through all of your defenses and you still get hijacked, we have a post. But all that's done in 3 minutes. Not this part, not what we did last week. But if you're entering into things with a growth mindset, this whole thing can be less than 3 minutes. 2 minutes, we're done. 2 minutes is all it takes. But you have to choose to do it, and that's why we need something bigger than yourself, like purpose, self-actualization, or something along those lines. All right, that is it. We'll see you next week, 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, right here on LinkedIn.